There's no doubt that if you were sitting down as a young boy in, let's say, the late 1970s and wrote down, I want to be a film producer and this is what I'd like to happen, is pretty much the pattern of My Beautiful Laundrette for an aspiring film producer. I mean, they gave us the money. It was a fantastic script. A brilliant actor decided to do it, a brilliant director, interesting writer, edgy material. So I think that was a gift. And it's a brilliant gift that I'll always be grateful to Stephen Ford. When you take a bird's eye view, it was an interesting point in film and cinema and everything visual, actually, at that point, because it was the beginning of the 1980s. Channel 4 had just started, so there was a whole sort of thing about independent people making films. Is that the music video industry had just really kicked into gear, and which meant a lot of young people were sort of getting themselves into the industry and making little films for music clips and all the rest of it. And also we were in the middle of Thatcherism, which was about the end of the unions, apart from anything else. And the film industry up to that point had been very tightly unionized, and it was a very difficult nut to crack if you weren't part of a family or part of the family of film. So all of those three things were sort of happening, and I started a little music video company with my then partner Sarah Radcliffe, and our intent was to work with film directors, because we had both had a sort of desire to work in the film industry and make movies.
I remember there was a wine bar in Soho we used to meet in regularly and talk about setting up companies and doing music videos together, and awful lot of talk. And then suddenly Derek Jarman, who I knew from the Tempest, rang me up and said, I've been asked to do a video for a band called Orange Juice. You better come and do it with me. So, and we obviously needed an assistant and what have you, and Tim and I worked together, and that was really the first thing we produced together. And that was the beginning of our music video company, Aldabra, which did about 80 music videos, none of which are that memorable. And that was how we met Stephen. And when we, in a fairly calculated way, kind of thought, right, we talked a lot and obviously wanted to make films, and the music videos was a learning curve and a means to an end. And we talked about working with all the directors whose work we adored, Nick Rogue, Stephen Frears, Derek, obviously. But you couldn't, as young wannabe producers, ring up a Stephen and say, I'd like to produce your next film. It doesn't work like that. So we then thought, okay, well, if we get to know them, this is obviously the way forward. So we asked a series of film directors to do music videos, which they kind of thought were fun to begin with, because you didn't have the constraints of commercials, you didn't have the client and the minutiae and all the rest of it.
So Stephen and I had done a music video for a band called Heaven 17, and he phoned me and he said, listen, I've been delivered this script. It's been developed by Channel 4, and I'd like you to read it. There's a guy called David Rose who'd come out of broadcasting, who's still alive, in fact, in his 90s, and his assistant stroke then wife, Karen Barbara, who were the commissioning editors for film. And the first thing that they did when they came in was they went out to interesting theatres and things around the country to commission interesting writers to write stuff that was about their lives and about their worlds. And one of those people was Hanif, who was working at the Royal Court at the time. I thought, this is a world I didn't know anything about, the Pakistani immigrant world, and I thought this is what great drama is, isn't it? And then you drop this brutish boy into the middle of it, Johnny, and wow, that's two worlds colliding in a magnificent way, and that feels edgy and dangerous, and in this guy's hands I don't know what's going to happen, sort of thing.
My father wants to see you.
How's Celine today? Wearing too much perfume. Eyelash.
I think it was, in a way, it's bravery at the time. I mean, no holds barred. It attacked racism, homophobia, you name it, it was in there, but with very endearing characters, and real characters, real people. That's what it felt like.
Good. Fancy coming for a walk, then?
I think we just took what Hanif had written as correct and loved the fact that it wasn't the standard vision of Pakistani family in corner shops and all the rest of it.
So Stephen says, we got to go and see these guys from Channel 4, you know, because they're the people who commissioned it, and they're the people who maybe we can get them to pay for it. So we go up Charlotte Street, and this was in November. And as we're going through the door entrance into Channel 4, into Charlotte Street, he said, I only make films in February. I said, what? And so we go upstairs, and Karen and David are very, very polite and awfully nice. And we have this meeting, and they say, that's nice to all of you. And they say, so they look at me and they say, how much do you think this film's going to cost? And I haven't got a clue, but I remember, it's dollars, isn't it, for movies, basically. So I say, $1 million, not having a clue. And then they said, well, when can you do it? And I said, well, he only makes films in February, so we need to get started. And that was that. And so it was the easiest commission that Working Titles had in its filmmaking history, that's for sure.
Channel 4 was the best thing that happened to my generation, without a doubt. As independents, you could work for them. And getting into the BBC was, you know, was something you kind of didn't even think you could possibly achieve. Any more than getting a union card was. I remember applying to ACTT and being told you have to have worked on 3 films. Well, how do you work on any film if you need a card to... So the only card you could get was a producer, actually, which is where Tim and I started, because we wouldn't have got in as production personnel. Channel 4 was doing incredibly exciting television for the time. I was lucky, I did a TV series for them at the very beginning, the comic strip Presents. And what we got away with, I mean, compared to the BBC was establishment and sort of grown up as far as we were concerned. And ITV was a combination of companies. And again, you know, to work for ITV, it wasn't easy. So the reason that Channel 4 was so exciting was twofold, really. One, that we had access to it. And it kind of felt ours in a bizarre way. It was our voice, our generation. You could be brave and take risks and make political statements that you believed in. Because the finance was coming from one source, I think that was the primary reason, you know, we got drip-fed the pre-production money, which was fantastic, because it enabled us to get started, to find locations, to get cast.
You like the work? Oh, come on, for Christ's sake. Help me with my accounts.
Debbie McWilliams was the casting director. I've no idea where she found lovely Gordon from. I would imagine it was a wide casting call, and he came in, and Stephen did most of the casting on his own.
Follow me.
I remember saying to Stephen, when we met Dan, oh, great, let's get him. And then he said, no. We've got to put him in a room with Gordon, because we knew that Gordon was probably the only lad who could act the part. And he said, if there's no chemistry between the two of them, then we don't have a picture. And I remember it very clearly, because in so many films subsequent to that, you haven't had the opportunity to do that because they're stars or whatever. And actually, it's such an important thing to do, because if there's no chemistry between two people in a room, it's highly unlikely that you'll be able to achieve chemistry on a screen. Sometimes you can, but almost always you can't. And so that it was a good little lesson to learn. I remember the other lesson I learned from Stephen is when we found the location for the Laundrette, which was in South London in Vauxhall. He turned around to me and he said, okay, we don't have much time to shoot this. So every other location for this film is going to be in walking distance of where we're standing now. And it pretty much was, actually. And it was another good lesson. You know, as one street's pretty much like another, one house is pretty much like another. And actually, your greatest enemy quite often when you're making a movie is time. And it's all, you know, it's just little lessons like that, which are so good. And you only get that from experience, but I remember distinctly him saying that to me.
It was definitely a different view of London. I don't think there'd been very many feature films set in that kind of urban environment in London. London had been far more the backdrop in films to date, whether they were thrillers or... I can't remember very many films about London and Londoners. So it definitely felt as though we were making a film about London for Londoners, and that in itself felt new and fresh and different. Everyone worked very closely. Probably easier then because apparently the total cast and crew was only 60-something people. Don't think you could do that today somehow or other. But it did make for a big family, kind of. So if people like Tim and I didn't know what we were doing, it was kind of everybody helped us along our way.
I don't recall a production being tricky in any way, and that because you're shooting it in a limited number of days, you're always up against the clock. And Hanif was there all the time, so that any ups and downs or script changes were pretty efficiently dealt with. And Stephen's a very efficient filmmaker too.
I think there were probably some night shots that we had to compromise on, or Stephen and Oliver had to move quite quickly on. There was one night when we could not keep everybody quiet in a housing estate somewhere in Wandsworth. I mean, whatever bribery, whatever we offered, there was just no way, and they started throwing things out of the windows and telling us to be quiet. Obviously, then everybody woke up, and there were nights like that, and on a tight 6-week schedule, you know, you couldn't go back to any location, so if it rained, you kind of just kept going and hoped for the best. So I shouldn't think that when it came to Mick Audsley cutting it, he had that many choices. But all credit to Stephen, I mean, he got there. I remember being involved in the music. That was great. It was actually the first score Hans did. I can't remember why they decided to be credited Ludus Tenalis, and it's sort of not recognised as being his first film because they called themselves, maybe that was what they always called themselves when they worked together. He did the Laundrette Gurgles. But that was innovative in its own way. I mean, nobody had done music like that on films, I don't think. It was kind of original and out there and different.
So the Hans' story is this, is that he had a band called Buggles, and he was the first guy in film music to start properly playing with a computer, basically a Fairlight. And he got a job in a music studio called Lily Yard, which was Stanley Myers was a composer. And Stanley was a composer who did a lot of British films, and he'd done The Deer Hunter, basically, and won the Academy Award for that. And Stanley was a nighttime man, and he's a nighttime man he's dead now, and he wouldn't mind me saying, but he liked the girls, basically. So quite often when we showed up at night, Stanley wouldn't be around, and Hans was. And so Hans did quite a bit of the music for My Beautiful Laundrette, and then Sarah and I made a film called A World Apart, which was a film about South Africa. Chris Menges directed it. We thought, you know, Stanley's never around, so let's let Hans be the composer on this movie. So Hans came down to Zimbabwe with us and recorded all sorts of music and all the rest of it. It was a beautiful movie, but nobody really saw it because the distribution wasn't quite right. But one very important person for Hans did see it, and that was Barry Levinson's wife. And Barry Levinson was making Rain Man. And she said to Barry, "Oh, you've got to hear this music, it's amazing." And he used as his temps the music for A World Apart on Rain Man. And when he came to decide who the composer was going to be, he said, "Listen, I've fallen in love with this music. I've got to get this kid out of, where is he? He's out of the UK. Let's get him to come over and do it." That was the beginning of Hans' story. As I said, earlier on, it was made for television. But actually, I remember distinctly when we screened it here at BAFTA, and there were a few critics in there who went, ho-hum. And then somebody from the Edinburgh Film Festival saw it and invited the film to go to Edinburgh, so we all went up there. And John Schlesinger was the chairman of the film jury that year. And I'd met him a couple of times, and, you know, he was an infamous old queen, basically, so I knew that he was going to like the movie quite a bit. So I steeled myself and went up to him in the street, and I said, "Mr. Schlesinger, there's a film that I really think you should see. That's fantastic. It's made by Stephen Frears, and it's about this world and all the rest of it." And so he arrived with sort of entourage into the screening in the film house. And Stephen and I we were so frightened, we went to a pub next door, actually, or a hotel, and drank a lot. And at the end of it, there was this sort of amazing reaction led by Lord Schlesinger.
It's really exciting when a film you've been involved with hits a chord with the audience and they respond. I don't think I've ever been in a screening like that. It was very nice to hear people responding in a way that we responded to the script, which was great, a great premise, great characters, brave, energetic, all those sort of things. And you kind of thought, yeah, that's why we made it. It was only the success at Edinburgh that catapulted it onto the big screen. Even for a few years after that, Channel 4 had a policy that you shot on 16, and then if, as with Beautiful Laundrette, the film got fantastic critical acclaim or maybe tested well at test screenings, then they would consider it going into the cinema and going out theatrically.
It certainly started a dialogue, but not. It wasn't like, oh my God, we've just blown up an atomic bomb sort of thing. It was, you know, life was edgier out there in those days, and it was a very different world that we all lived in. And it was you know, I remember seeing when Thatcher died recently. I remember seeing some news footage of her arriving at Downing Street in 1979. I thought, fuck, that's the olden days. That really is the olden days. And we weren't very long after that in the mid 80s. So it was a really different time. And I think that I can't actually totally remember, but it is interesting how morality changes through time, as it were. And the gay thing was pretty big then because it was pre-AIDS, you know, and certainly in an urban centre, so it wasn't that shocking to any of us. You know, ironically, 5 or 6 years later, it probably would have been a great deal more shocking. And the multicultural aspect of it, that was what was fresh about it.
I think on a certain level, we were kind of unaware of the impact of the success of the film on working title, on us. I'd already gone off to make Caravaggio, which was fully funded by the BFI. Maybe it was Personal Services that Tim did next. We both got our next films. And we kind of went from film to film. We, for quite a long time, we didn't really think about overall plans for running a company. We were both definitely in those days more excited by making films than running a company. In fact, the latter we weren't that good at. By the time Graham Bradstreet joined on the finance side, we were way behind with certain payments to the Inland Revenue, to put it mildly, because it just wasn't anything that I in particular was interested in. I mean, we opened the envelopes, we weren't that bad, but we weren't very good at... we needed a finance director badly, and should have got one a couple of years earlier than we did. And we then worked together we just went from film to film. It was fantastic. We did sort of a film or two, probably 2 every 18 months, completely unheard of.
We realised that, and I still do, is that if you go inside the comfort zone, you want to stay inside the comfort zone of what somebody wants to spend on something, because that will give you freedom. If you go out, as soon as you go outside of the comfort zone, it doesn't really matter whether it's $1 million movie or $100 million movie, to be quite honest, is that if you make a $100 million movie for $95 million, they think you're a genius. If you make it for 105, though it doesn't make any difference at all, they think you're an arsehole. And it's the same thing and it's always been the same at every movie. So sort of tight fiscal control is something that we've always sort of encouraged in everybody, because that way you get freedom, you get creative freedom. And that seemed to be just something that evolved inside the company. And really, because there have been 2 major cycles of working title, and the first one was that 85 through to 92, and then 92 and subsequent, because 85 to 92 I was working with Sarah, and we were totally independent, basically, so we were scrubbling around trying to put films together and finding the money from here, there, and everywhere. There were no huge budgets. There were some good films, some not great films. There were some fantastic creative relationships, you know, like the Frears relationship, the Richard Curtis relationship, the Rowan Atkinson relationship. There were a lot of creative relationships that started in that time. but we were pretty disorganized, and we were almost certainly always insolvent. And that I learned in that period that I thought, wow, this is tricky, and that making these films all independently, what happens is you scrabble some money together to develop them. You're having to pay the bills as you're probably putting them into production before they're really ready to go into production. Nobody's spending enough time on working out what they are, and then you're working about distribution. You're pre-selling this, you're Harvey Weinsteining that, and all the rest of it. And it just didn't really make sense. So I thought, either you go and live in America, because it's probably, you can make films at this scale in the UK, but there's nothing really outside of that, or else you try and find somebody to finance you. And I was lucky enough to find somebody to finance us. And at that point, I decided to work with Eric. We found funding basically in 1992 and set up the company that we have today, really. I think there was a few movies, and My Beautiful Laundrette was probably at the middle of them, that said, actually, and at the same time, Goldcrest had made The Mission and Revolution and Absolute Beginners, and it just shifted the balance like that, and it put the film for thing on the map, and it said, here, there's some edge and something that's culturally interesting going on here, and it encouraged people to make more movies. It was good for that sector of cinema, and specifically for Working Title, it was great because it gave us a leg up to get started.